of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson's Middle East program on an issue that could not be more timely and topical, the rise of the Shiites and its implications for the Middle East. Our speaker today is one of the world's preeminent experts on this topic, Yitzhak Nakash, a former Woodrow Wilson Center fellow, his author most recently of Reaching for Power, the Shia in the Modern Arab World. He's spending 2006-2007 as a Carnegie Corporation scholar working on his new project. But today he will be speaking on the rise of the Shiites and its implications for the Middle East. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Nakash back to the Woodrow Wilson Center. We look forward to his remarks. He'll speak for 25 to 30 minutes. That'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussion from the floor. Yitzhak, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Bob, for your kind words. It's really a pleasure to be back again, and good afternoon for everyone. In the past few decades, there has been a surge in religious expression throughout the Middle East, both among Shiites, Sunnis, among Muslims, and non-Muslims. Within Islam, religious revivalism has taken peaceful as well as violent forms and has manifested itself differently among Shiites and Sunnis. The upheaval generated by the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1978-79 emboldened Shiites in the Middle East and reinforced a trend of activism within Shiism that continues to this day. During the 1970s and 1980s, Shiites were often associated in the West with Islamic radicalism and terrorism. Yet in the period since the Gulf War of 1991, Shiites on the whole have been moving away from violence and towards a dialogue with the West and with other members of their societies. This trend has coincided with the rise of Shiite clerics as community leaders capable of exerting moderation over followers, as exemplified by Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani of Najaf. By contrast, Sunni clerics have experienced a crisis of authority in modern times and have lost the capacity to restrain radical Sunni Islamists. The emphasis on accommodation among Shiites has become clearer in the wake of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, amid the displays of militancy by Sunni groups influenced by Wahhabism, which is dominant in Saudi Arabia, and by the writing of the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb. The increase in acts of violence by Shiites against Western targets since the mid-1990s has stood in contrast to the growth of Sunni-sponsored terrorism by Al-Qaeda and other militant groups, including the 9/11 attacks in the United States, the bombings in Bali, Madrid, Riyadh, London, and Amman, as well as the gruesome beheading of hostages in Iraq, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, a strategy that all Shiite groups have condemned, including the Lebanese Hezbollah organization, the Sadr movement in Iraq, and the hardline regime in Iran. The trend towards accommodation among Shiites reflects their desire for political empowerment. Today, Shiites are attempting to take advantage of the shifting geopolitics of the Middle East, spurred by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. They are seeking to carve out a political space for themselves in the Middle East that until recently was dominated by Sunni ruling elites or even by Christians, as was the case in Lebanon. This trend is evident among Shiite communities in the Arab world as well as in Iran. Its significance should not be downplayed by the recent war between Hezbollah and Israel, or by the unfortunate denial of the Holocaust by Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and his outrageous statements that Israel should be wiped off the map, rhetoric that enabled him to occupy center stage. The point I would like to make here is that the coming few months would be critical in determining whether Shiites continue to seek accommodation with the West or whether they would become radicalized again. Such a development, on top of the growing militancy of Sunni groups, will make the US position in Iraq and other parts of the Middle East untenable. An overview of the demographic spread of Shiism in the Middle East underscores the high stakes surrounding the Shiite bid for power. Shiites constitute 80% of the native population of the oil-rich Persian Gulf region. We're talking about 80 to 90 million Shiites. For the most part, the Persian Gulf Shiites adhere to the main 12er branch of Shiism. But there are small offshoots, notably the Ismailis in southwestern Arabia and the Zaydis in Yemen. In Iran, Shiites are at least 80% of the population, and Shiism is the state religion. The large majority of Iranian Shiites are Persians. The Arab Shiites form 60 and 70% of the population of Iraq and Bahrain, respectively. The current Iraqi government is led by Shiites. There are significant Shiite communities in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Oman. In Lebanon, Shiites are at least 40% of the population, or the largest single sect. There is also a small Shiite community in Syria, a country ruled by the Alawis, who are members of a heterodox sect of Shiism. The large share of Shiites within the Muslim population of the Middle East and their desire for political empowerment explain the fear of Sunni governments of a crescent of Shiite governments and movements that would alter the balance of power between Shiites and Sunnis in the region. The fear of a Shiite bloc dominating the Middle East is overblown, however, because each community is organized differently and is driven by a different set of socio-political and nationalist motivations. Let me try to illustrate this point through the examples of Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. Iran is a country with a keen sense of Persia's centuries-old primacy in the Persian Gulf. The challenge facing the international community in dealing with Iran is how to respond to its growing power in the Middle East. Iran today is very different from the embattled Islamic Republic of the early 1980s, with a vast majority of Iranians now clamoring for reform, and a vast women's movement overshadowing its Sunni counterpart in the Arab world. What's more, the hardliners in Tehran share the US goal of bringing stability to Iraq and the larger Middle East, a reality that should not be obscured by the debates over Iran's nuclear intentions, its aid to the Lebanese Hezbollah and to Shiite groups in Iraq, and the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as president. Ahmadinejad is not a messianic madman, nor is he a Shiite version of Saddam Hussein, who launched 2 devastating wars in the Persian Gulf in the name of Arabism, or of Osama bin Laden, who declared jihad against the United States and the West in the name of Islam. Instead, Ahmadinejad is a radical populist who has allied himself with a coalition of third world leaders, including Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, all of whom have capitalized on the general resentment against the world's strongest power in the non-Western world and in Latin America. Ahmadinejad's government may yet turn out to be the least religious in orientation that Iran has had since the start of the revolution. And should his socio-economic policies fail to improve the living conditions of the poor classes, whose members voted for him overwhelmingly in 2005, he could lose office in the next elections. Indeed, The results of the elections for municipal councils held in December 2006 were a major setback to Ahmadinejad and may spell trouble for him down the road. The US occupation brought American troops to Iran's door, and as such it was bound to raise tensions between America and Iran as they vie for dominance in the Persian Gulf. Nevertheless, Iran could play a positive role in the US goal of bringing stability to the Middle East, provided the United States begins to engage Iran politically. The hardliners in Tehran know that they will lose from a full-scale civil war in Iraq, which would destabilize the Persian Gulf and undermine Iran's interests in the region. Hence, they may be receptive to a détente with America in exchange for a grand bargain. If there is to be a deal with the current regime, it will have to be made not only with the reformers, but also with the more powerful conservative politicians and clerics in Iran. Washington and Tehran would need to acknowledge the mistakes of the past and begin a dialogue. The need for a dialogue has become all the more pressing because of the Iraqi parliament vote in October 2006 to approve creating autonomous regions, which could worsen sectarian and ethnic conflicts in Iraq and might lead to the creation of a predominantly Shiite region consisting of 9 provinces in southern Iraq. Imagine the impact in Iran of a public announcement by the Bush administration that regime change is off the table, provided Iran accounts for its nuclear program, stops its support for terrorism, and acknowledges the right of all Middle Eastern states to exist in peace. Such an announcement, accompanied by an offer for improved political and economic relations and student exchanges with Iran, could put Ahmadinejad and the hardline clerics on the defensive, enable the US to build bridges to their reformers, the harbingers of any political change in Iran, and better contain Iran's influence in the Middle East and its pursuit of nuclear capability. Improved US-Iranian relations, moreover, could also help contain Syria and Hezbollah, and in the long run could increase the prospects of peace between Israel and Syria and Lebanon. The example of Iraq illustrates the complex problem of sectarianism in the Arab world. For 82 years in modern Iraq, a Sunni minority who constitutes some 17% of the population and based in central Iraq held sway over the Shiite majority of 60% spread in southern and central Iraq, and over a Kurdish minority of 20% in the north. The Sunnis felt entitled to rule Iraq, considering themselves the heirs of the Ottoman Empire. Their claim to rule was backed by the support of Arab Sunni leaders who have viewed Shiism as heresy and have felt more comfortable with Sunni rule next door. This reality prevailed until the collapse of the Ba'ath regime in 2003. The rise of the Shiites to power following the US invasion has reinforced the sectarian struggle between Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq. That struggle is primarily political, and it reflects the competition between the two groups over the right to rule and to define the meaning of nationalism in the country. Whereas until 2003, the majority of Shiites preferred Iraqi nationalism, Iraq's Sunni rulers adopted Pan-Arabism as their main ideology and took Shiite preference of Iraqi nationalism as proof that the Shiites did not share the commitment of the government to an Arab state extending beyond the borders of Iraq. The competition between Shiites and Sunnis over the right to rule is in full play today in Iraq, but it has assumed a strongly religious dimension. In the decade preceding the US invasion, there was a surge in religious expression in Iraq, encouraged in part by the Ba'ath regime. The US invasion has further reinforced this trend and led to the emergence of clerics as community leaders. This development, particularly as it relates to the Shiite community, carries implications for Iraq's future and for the future of the larger Middle East. For well over a century, Shiite clerics have led movements advocating parliamentary rule and just governance in the Middle East. In post-Ba'ath Iraq, clerics have again taken the lead, in large part because there's hardly any form of secular civil society in the country today that can act as the nucleus of an Iraqi political system. In its 35 years of rule, the Ba'ath wiped out all forms of civil organization not controlled directly by the party. To make matters worse, the 12 years of sanctions that preceded the US invasion, reinforced by an unemployment rate of some 50% in its wake, have reduced the Iraqi middle class to bare subsistence. It will be years before a viable secular middle class could re-emerge and balance the power of the religious groups, who are now the most vocal, organized, and politically mobilized force in Iraq. Post-Ba'ath Iraq presents a challenge to US policymakers. How to deal with the power of the religious groups and their militias, and how to keep Iraq as a unified state and reintegrated into the Arab world. This task has become difficult because of the deteriorating situation in Iraq and because of the recent Iraqi parliament vote to approve creating autonomous regions in the country. Nevertheless, there is still a chance that Iraq will end up as a unified federative state because most Iraqis, as well as Iraq's neighbors, dread the consequences of partition. If Iraq does not descend into a full-scale civil war and survives as a unified state, it is likely that we will see contentious debates among Iraqi Shiites over the nature of government in Iraq. If one follows this scenario, there is a reasonable chance that in the long run, the model of government pushed by Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani since 2003 will be accepted by Iraqi Shiite parties and by default by Iraqi Sunnis and Kurds as well. Sistani's model accepts the reality of a nation state led by lay politicians and does not advocate that clerics should be the final arbiters of state affairs. This model recognizes the complex social reality of Iraq and envisaged the creation of strong legislature and a representative government accountable to the voters. As such, it constitutes a departure from the political realities in both Iran and the Arab world, where rulers have been free to impose their will on legislators and disregard human rights. While it is not likely that Shiite Islamists will embrace Western-style democracy, Sistani's model offers a vision of a decent and representative government. His model could also help pull Iraqi Shiites away from the political orbit of Iran and offer an alternative to the system of government currently in place in the Islamic Republic. What's more, Sistani's model could counter those Sunni militants who have been fighting Muslims seeking to build bridges to the West and willing to cooperate with America. The rise of the Shiites is reverberating not only in the Persian Gulf, but elsewhere in the Middle East. This is evident from the push of Lebanese Shiites for greater political share in the state following the war between Hezbollah and Israel. Lebanon is a country of 17 sects organized politically along communal lines. It is a state governed by a pact between the sects. The relative power held by each sect has been determined by the Taif Accord, signed by the Lebanese in 1990 following their civil war. While in the first half of the 20th century, Shiites were on the margin of Lebanese politics, they have since emerged as a powerful political community that no other group can ignore. This development marks the revival of Shiism in Lebanon after centuries of decline. A revival that carries strong religious and class overtones, and which is reshaping power relations between Shiites and other communities in the country. The events surrounding the Lebanese Civil War and the Iranian Islamic Revolution radicalized Lebanese Shiites and led to the rise of Hezbollah in the early 1980s as the leading Shiite movement alongside Amal. Yet in the course of 2 decades, Hezbollah evolved from a revolutionary movement into a political party that courted Shiite as well as Sunni and Christian voters in mixed areas. At the same time, Hezbollah and Amal began cooperating in parliament in demand of greater Shiite power in the state. Nevertheless, until April 2005, the bid of Lebanese Shiites for power was restrained by Lebanon's system of proportional representation and by Syria's military presence in the country, which ensured, that Shiites could not sweep to national victory. Although following the elections held after the Syrian withdrawal, Shiites increased their representation in parliament and the government, it fell short of their 40% of the population. Hence, the new bid for power in the wake of the war between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006, a bid that Hezbollah's foes have labeled as a coup d'etat. The war launched by Israel against Hezbollah in response to the abduction and killing of Israeli soldiers by the Lebanese organization has had implications for the balance of power in the region and for Hezbollah's standing in Lebanon. The war did not destroy Hezbollah, and it damaged the myth of Israeli invincibility. Interestingly, as the war unfolded, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, did not present the fighting as a jihad against Israel, and he didn't speak about wiping Israel off the map. The Israel-Hezbollah conflict was not part of the war between Islam and the West, as waged by Al-Qaeda and by other Sunni jihadists in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as in Europe and here in the United States. Instead, it was a war aimed at restoring Israel's power of deterrence and redefining the rules of the game in the Middle East, where the geopolitics are shifting to the advantage of Shiites. Within Lebanon, the outcome of the war enhanced Hezbollah's stature as the leading movement of Lebanese Shiites in their push for greater power in the state. Nasrallah has reaffirmed that Lebanon remained a final state for its Shiites, and he pledged not to push the country for another civil war. Yet at the same time, he challenged the current government and essentially demanded a renegotiation of the Taif agreement and a new pact between the Shiites and the states. To increase their clout, Hezbollah and Amal allied themselves with Michel Aoun, a Christian Maronite and former army general, and the leader of the Christian Free Patriotic Movement. This development signaled a major realignment of power relations among the sects in Lebanon, with the current governing coalition of Sunni, Druze, and Christian parties, backed by the United States and France, and Hezbollah and its allies, supported by Iran and Syria. The new Shiite-led alliance has held mass demonstrations since November 2006. All Shiite ministers withdrew from the government, rendering it an interim government with limited power. Members of the new Shiite Christian alliance led by Hezbollah demanded a national unity government and veto power over cabinet decisions, a move intended not only to wrest control from the governing coalition, but also to influence the political direction of Lebanon at a time when Shiites are on the rise in the Middle East. As the examples of Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon illustrate, the upsurge of the Shiites may lead to a new balance of power in the Middle East. Iran is likely to emerge as a power in the Persian Gulf. Within the Arab world, ruling Sunni elites can no longer take the Shiites for granted. Israel will remain the dominant force in the Middle East in the foreseeable future. But Israel increasingly finds itself forced to develop new strategies of deterrence in order to deal with Iran's growing power. Hence, the secret contacts reported last summer between Israel and Saudi Arabia, two countries that would like to see Iran and Hezbollah weakened. For its part, America would need to perform a delicate balancing act in the coming years. The US would probably try to contain Shiite power while using it as a bulwark against Sunni militants. At the same time, America would need to remain committed to political reform in the Middle East based on free and direct elections, but without upsetting the power of traditional Sunni allies in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. The US would have to do all this while maintaining its strategic interests in the Persian Gulf and securing the flow of oil from the region. This is certainly not going to be an easy task. And I think I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much, Yitzhak. You've covered an enormous amount of terrain, literally and figuratively. We'll open it up now for comments and questions. Let me open the discussion from the chairs, from the chair, picking up on what you turned to in your final moments about strategies of deterrence. Since 9/11, let me just sort of preface it with a few contextual remarks. Since 9/11, the Bush administration has argued that the threats facing the United States derive from the character of our adversaries, unpredictable rogue states, undeterrable terrorist groups, and the possible cooperation between them. One of the drivers underlying those who call for preventive military action against Iran's nuclear infrastructure, the primary argument made is that Iran, under this leadership and this current president, is essentially undeterrable, and that action, military action, might have to be taken before they reach a point of no return. So I'd be interested in your take on this issue about whether the Iranian regime is deterrable or not, and tied into that, looking empirically at what was done during the Lebanon war, and whether there were some, as you read the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah, some red lines that they were not willing to cross in terms of categories of weapons or the use, reports that there were Revolutionary Guards there, whether they were there to constrain use of weapons, how you read this issue of deterrence in the Iranian case, because threshold assumptions about that really have big downstream effects in terms of policy outcomes.
Yes. Okay, so you have here two questions, and I'll try to answer them and also connect them. What I was actually proposing is that the United States would give Iran a bear's hug. I know that we're dealing with a very difficult regime, but the fact of the matter is we didn't want to deal with the previous regime under Khatami, because Khatami was not seen as good enough. We wanted a more secular, more amenable president to us, and instead we got Ahmadinejad. So I'm not sure that this is an excuse that holds a lot of water. Your point about the the war between Hezbollah and Israel, I do think that although Iran was obviously involved in providing weapons and support to Hezbollah, there were red lines that were not crossed. For example, there was no use of long-term missiles launched from Lebanon against Israel. A missile that would hit Tel Aviv, for example, would change completely the picture. So it seems to me that while Iran was interested in making a point, there was a certain line that wasn't crossed. Beyond that, I'm not a military expert, but it seems to me that this is one thing that we have to take into account. The interesting thing about the post-war situation in Lebanon, the current situation in which we are now, the crisis that Lebanese are experiencing, the interesting thing is that it is the Arab League that is leading the effort for mediation among the Lebanese. As far as I know, the Iranians are not involved, definitely not involved in a public way. And the fact that Hezbollah has accepted Arab League mediation and is about to send, I read, a delegation to Saudi Arabia is an encouraging sign. It's also an indication that Iran would find it difficult to really influence and shape politics in Lebanon down the line.
Thank you. We'll start with this gentleman. If people, there are microphones, if you could, they'll come to you in a second. If you could, gentleman in the second row here, please. If speakers could please identify themselves.
Thank you. Paul Sham from the Middle East Institute here in Washington. Thank you, Professor Nakash, for a illuminating view that goes against a lot of the conventional wisdom in this town. I would like to focus on the independence, or your view of that, of the varying Shiite groups. The implication of what you said was that Hezbollah, unlike the belief in this country and in Israel, has in many ways its own agenda. It is certainly allied with Iran, but it is not a proxy, which is the word that's usually used. I would be interested in your comments on that, on what we would expect if Hezbollah were able to get the blocking majority, or the alliance of Hezbollah, Amal, and the Christians would get a blocking majority in this country. It's assumed to be that would deliver Lebanon into Iran's hands. I'd be interested in your commentary, and also related in what would a Shiite controlled government not under American influence mean in Iraq with regard to relationship to Iran? Thank you.
Okay, the question that you are asking, and in a way also Bob's question, prompts me to say something that I wanted to say later on, but I think that's the time to say that obviously we reached a point that that we have to think beyond the Iraq box at this point. And solutions that would be implemented in Iraq or in Lebanon would have to take account of developments in the entire region. So it may very well be that the solution in Lebanon would be part of collective bargaining that would include solutions or disputes elsewhere in the region. My feeling is that given the nature of Lebanese society and the way it is organized, it is very likely, bearing something that is very difficult to predict, that there would be some sort of solution to the current crisis in Lebanon, which would end up, you can call it Taif Plus, or would end up modifying the formula under which power is distributed. And it seems to me that eventually Hezbollah would have to back down on the issue of veto power. But the reality is in Lebanon that the Shiites, and it's not just Hezbollah, it's that the Shiite community as a whole is seeking greater power. And it happens, now this is the situation that Hezbollah is leading this bid. So it's not just about, the game is not just with Hezbollah, it's with the entire Shiite community. My feeling is that we will end up with a mediation, by and large Arab mediation to the problem, and that it would increase the share of the Lebanese. To what extent, I don't know. And again, whatever happens there, I won't be surprised if it's part of a larger bargaining. In a way, you're asking me what would constitute success in Iraq. From my point of view, success in Iraq, I would define it like this: a unified Iraq with a decent and representative government, a state that is governed by a power-sharing agreement. So yes, I do have some aspects of the Lebanese model in mind. And it is going to be a Shiite-led Iraq. A Shiite-led with Islamists. That's the reality on the ground. But as I said, it will not necessarily be Islamists who advocate the notion of Wilayat al-Faqih, which would make it different. And it seems to me that that's right now the best case scenario that I can give you. But again, in order for this to happen, it would have to take into account developments in the region as a whole. The actions of Iran and Saudi Arabia in particular, as well as other neighbors, will determine the outcome in Iraq. So, there you have it.
Thank you. Our fellow.
Thank you very much for what I think is a classic study of the forgotten communities in the Middle East.
Could you just identify yourself, please?
I'm Khalid Ahmed. I'm here at the Wilson Center. And my...
Is that microphone, are you hearing it on?
Yeah, it is on.
Okay.
And the book I'm writing is on sectarian violence from Pakistan going on to Iraq. I have two questions. One is the validity, the continued validity of the Grand Ayatollahs of Najaf. Out of the four, three are foreigners. And in your book, you have actually wondered whether Sistani has a voting right. Because one Grand Ayatollah is from Pakistan, and he went there 40 years ago, has never been back. We know that his visa has to be extended. He's on a Pakistani passport. Similar is the case with the Afghan Grand Ayatollah. Sistani, of course, has rejected Wilayat al-Faqih. He is definitely a restraining factor. But I think once the radicals come to power, they're bound to ignore him. Mainly because he's not an Iraqi, and he probably on a different passport. And there's one report that on occasions his guarantor for the issuance of visa was Sadr, which means that Muqtada al-Sadr has to stand guarantee for the issuance of his visa. Bashir Hussain, who's from Pakistan, doesn't get along with Sistani very well. He's more anti-American than Sistani, but he's marginal, and there is always the fear that the Grand Ayatollahs, whom the Iraqi Shia follow, may be marginalized very easily by Abdulaziz and by Muqtada al-Sadr, because they are the powerful people. My second question is that jihad has gone sectarian. Jihad, which was spearheaded by Al-Qaeda, and we have seen after Zarqawi that Al-Qaeda has accepted a sectarian identity, and most of it is now manifesting in itself in Pakistan too. Will that make a dent against the original jihad against the West? Because now the passion is really sectarian. These are the two questions.
Concerning the first question, there's no doubt in my mind that the Marja'iyya, the religious leadership in Najaf, is experiencing pressures. It has experienced them since 2003, and even more so probably this coming year. And the four senior clerics are not monolithic in their opinions. This is why the only guarantee that you can put in place politically to ameliorate the ability of Sadr or Hakim to bypass the Marja'iyya altogether, which has acted as a moderating force, is to put in place a pluralistic system. You need a political system where Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds would be competing with one another. That's the essence. And if this isn't going to work, then we're shifting towards a very unhealthy. It would be a very unhealthy development. So that's the only thing I can tell you. I can tell you though that if you look at history as an indication, in moments of crisis, late 19th century, early 20th century, the leading clerics managed eventually to hold the tide. So it remains to be seen what would unfold in the coming year or so in Iraq. And once again, whatever happens in Iraq, because we are no longer confined to Iraq in the crisis, would have to take into account regional developments and how Iran and Saudi Arabia are going to behave. Let me say one more thing about radicalism before I turn to the issue of jihad. There are groups in Iraq that are participating in the political process that are even more radicals than Sadr or Hakim, and they happen to be Sunnis. Radicalism is stronger now among the Sunnis than it is among the Shiites. Concerning the issue of jihad, whether the sectarian war within Islam can overshadow the jihad against the West, there were moments in history when Muslim jurists ruled, including Ibn Taymiyyah, that you have to give preference to fighting the heretics inside Islam before you fight the West. It may very well be that if the trend towards more violence and sectarianism continues, that there would be more than one war, not just a war between Islam and the West, but wars within Islam. So it can be concomitant.
There's questions. Is that gentleman? Yeah, I think there's a microphone coming around.
Roby Barrett with CECOM. If we push, you talk about political reform and political liberalism in the Middle East and sponsoring it. How does this square with the current Shia or Alawi-ruled Syria, in which the Sunni Muslims are actually the majority?
It does not, and I'm not a favorite of that system. I am a historian, and by the way, what I told you is not a recipe to be implemented within a year or two. You can imagine that. And I suspect that eventually Syria will also experience a big change. And the Alawis will not rule Syria forever. So what I said does not, take into account this situation. It's a situation that is not a normal situation. And I suspect that sooner or later it would change.
Gentleman in the middle there. Glasses. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alan Mendelson. I'm a former official in the Clinton State Department. My question is, what is the downside for the United States were we to allow, indeed encourage, a civil war between the Shiites and the Sunnis right now? Now, I know the conventional wisdom would answer that, well, there will be a destabilization in the region, and that'll be terrible. But for those of us who still remember, there was a 10-year war between Iraq and Iran. That was a pretty well-contained war, and it didn't destabilize the world. And I just wonder why it's even in our interest to lose any troops in order to maintain in order to end the sectarian conflict. Maybe we should encourage it.
Hang on.
My feeling, and I'm offering it to you for whatever it's worth, that if we go down this road, the energy of the violence that would be unleashed would dwarf, I think, the Iran-Iraq war. Because if we're going to cut and run in Iraq, allow a fragmentation of Iraq, we're not only looking at potential destabilization of the Persian Gulf, we're looking at a situation that leads to the reshaping of the Middle East that was created following World War I. So it would be a crisis that would not be just confined to the Persian Gulf. You're looking here potentially at a crisis that may involve fights over creating new states, and I can see a possibility whereby Turkey, Iran, and Syria could interfere militarily in Iraq in order to prevent any partition plan that envisaged an independent Kurdish state, for example. So we're not just looking at the Persian Gulf here, we're looking at the Middle East as a whole, potentially. Which is why, and I'm not going into the question of whether we should start withdrawing troops or whether there should be a temporary troop surge. The point is, you cannot just cut and run and let this region, leave it for its own devices. I don't think this is an option. I think that there is a potential for something that would be much more frightening than the Iran-Iraq war. And just to tell you, the Iran-Iraq war was between two states. If we get into chaos, you will not have states fighting. You will have other entities that are not necessarily states. So the rules of the game would be even more brutal.
A little over 10 minutes left, a lot of hands. So if questions
Colonel-
could be short, please.
Colonel
Gentleman.
Datta, Foreign Policy Association. To my mind, ushering in of democracy had been rather too soon before ensuring the conditions of stability and law and order. For Iran, it was fine because they should be thankful to America for bringing in Middle East another Shia country, which will support in the longer run. And so far as the Sunnis are concerned, they are of the opinion that America is promoting the sectarian war because they are supporting the majority, and majorities of Shias. Now, how do you reconcile these 2 points of views in adopting a policy for Middle East?
Thank you.
Thankfully, I'm not a policy maker. I'm just a historian. But I can tell you that a historian, I can give you the observation that foreign policy is usually full of contradictions. It's not, unfortunately, it's not something pure that can be applied only in a very systematic way, only to treat one problem. Often you have situations whereby the policies are full of contradictions, and I suspect that that's what we're going to see. Whether the United States is encouraging a sectarian war right now, or I don't know if the United States is really encouraging a sectarian war. It seems to me that right now the United States is trying to manage a chaotic situation and no more than that, and to do it in a way that benefits America. So that's what I can tell you.
You're a good historian, but you'll never make it as a political scientist. Go ahead.
Could you, I'm Robert Dreyfus, a journalist here. Could you say a little bit about Syria in Iraq and its origins in Iran in 1982 and after that, and especially kind of what they were doing for that 21 years before the U.S. invasion of Iraq? And then how those obvious connections with Iran evolved over the past 4 years? And then part of the question is to what extent they have support inside Iraq now. Are they a power because of their militia, or do they truly have a grassroots political party kind of presence with clerics and others, who support them?
Yeah, Syria has its origin in the early 1980s.
Can you just drop a footnote there? Some people may not be familiar with it.
Yeah. Syria is the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. It is an organization that is associated very closely with the Hakim family. The Hakim family is very famous because in the late 70s, the sole leading cleric of the Shiite world was the father of Muhammad Bakr al-Hakim, who died a few years ago, and his brother Abdulaziz al-Hakim, who now is the head of Syria. Even before the Iran-Iraq war, but especially once the war started, the Ba'ath persecuted Shiites and targeted the Hakim family. A good number of members of that family were executed or died in mysterious circumstances. The two brothers, Muhammad Bakr al-Hakim and Abdulaziz, fled to Iran. It was in Iran, with Iranian help, with training of the Revolutionary Guard, that Syria was established. Syria was involved in the short-lived insurrection of the Shiites of Iraq in 1991 in the wake of the Gulf War. It was felt mainly in Karbala and in Basra. Throughout the 90s, there were sporadic contacts between Syria and Western governments. We know that there was some cooperation on the eve of this war. Syria does have the best contacts, I think, in Iraq with the current Iranian regime. And should the United States be interested in building a bridge to Iran, Syria would be an ideal candidate to act as the bridge. Inside Iraq, Syria, I think, is very strong in areas near Basra, in Najaf, and it does have a constituency that goes back to the period of Hakim, who was the Marja. However, you can see that given the style of Iraqi politics and the sense of patriotism and nationalism, that Sadr has more grassroots supporters. There is a tension between the various movements, with those around Sadr considering themselves the real Iraqi patriots who stayed behind during the Ba'ath regime. Nevertheless, I do think that Hakim has a real constituency, and you cannot discount Skiri.
Thank you. Any further questions in the back? Oh, yes. This is the gentleman there.
This is Hossein Shabazi. I'm a researcher, and I'd like to ask you about the relation between Iran and Muqtada Sadr. We all know that, or have been told that Iran has a great amount of influence in Iraq, and you just mentioned about Syria. But given the fact that Muqtada is very much Iraqi nationalist, and of course Iranians are not, there is also so much talk about relationship or support from Iran to Muqtada. I'd like to know about your impression about the cooperation and how that kind of relationship can be justified in the Iraqi nationalism, and whether or to what extent do you see support from Iran to Muqtada Sadr. And I might also add that there are also talk about Iran supporting other competing groups, even some Sunnis. Would you just in larger context elaborate on the support of Iran to all various groups in Iraq? Thank you.
As you give we'll make this the final question. Tagging onto that, if you could just expand, you talk about Iran having an interest in a stable Iraq, and that cuts against one of the conventional wisdoms. But how would they view the kind of relationship long-term they would want with Iraq? An Iraq that would sort of defer to Iran on key security issues so that Iran's sort of the security manager of the region? How would they see that relationship ideally from their perspective in the long run?
Yeah, the Iranians have been very clever in putting their eggs in various baskets in Iraq, not just the scary basket or the dawah, but it seems to me that between scary, dawah, and muqtada, Iran probably have the least leverage on muqtada sadr. I mean, we don't quite know how much leverage Iran has on any of these groups, because these groups, in order to gain legitimacy in Iraq, have to act first and foremost as Iraqis. You have to understand that. So yes, I think that Iran has some influence. In some 2 years ago, when Muqtada, in 2004 in fact, when Muqtada and the Americans had their first showdown, Iran actually was instrumental in putting pressures on Ayatollah Hariri in Qum, who was then the marja, the supreme authority that Muqtada followed, to the point that Hariri renounced Muqtada Sadr. So that was an episode that showed that Iran had some leverage. To what extent it has leverage to influence Sadr's activities inside Iraqi politics today, this is something that would have to be left to the Shiites inside Iraq themselves to resolve, including the Marja'iyah inside Iraq. Bob's question. It seems to me that while Iran would like to avoid chaos in Iraq, fragmentation of Iraq, Iran would like to see a Shiite-led Iraq, but a weak Iraq. That's, I think, the Iranian agenda. A weak also in terms of the strategics of the region, the ability of Iraq to threaten Iran militarily, but also weak enough so that Iran can retain the status of the champion of the Shiite cause.
Thank you. On behalf of Hala Esfandiari, who's director of the Middle East program, I'd like to thank you all for attending today. Please join me in thanking Yitzhak Nakash.